I spent most of my life wrapped up in the needs of my son and daughter-in-law, giving up parts of myself so their world could be just a little bit easier. Looking back now, I realize how much I did, how much I sacrificed, and how little I may have had left for me. It wasn't a sudden thing. It was a slow erosion, a routine of putting them first over decades. I'm Martha, turning 65 next month, and though I'm not exactly frail, the last few years have felt like I'm losing pieces of myself as others keep piling on. From the time my son Daniel was a little boy, I put my entire heart into his happiness and well-being. I gave up my job as a receptionist at a local clinic when he turned 5 because it took so long to find good childcare, and even longer to juggle work and raising him alone after my husband left us. So, that was sacrifice number 1, my career. I stopped earning, stopped building on myself, all so I could be there for Daniel from sunup to sundown. I told myself it was temporary, just until he was older, but those years stretched into decades. Sacrifice number 2 followed naturally. When Daniel married Lila, I quietly shelved some older friendships and dropped hobbies I loved. Their lives became a whirlwind after the wedding, and I was the go-to for every emergency, every favor, every babysitting need, free of charge. I rarely said no. I told myself it was love, support, family. But quietly, my world narrowed down to their needs, their schedules, their crises. I gave up personal time and quiet moments that once let me breathe. The third sacrifice hit me in ways I barely noticed at the time. I watched potential relationships with other people fade away as I poured every ounce of energy into making their lives smooth. Offers for dinner from friends, invitations to community events, even calls from my sister back home. I passed them all on. Instead, I was the unpaid chauffeur, the unpaid cook, the unpaid therapist. The truth is, I neglected my own emotional needs. Loneliness settled in deep, but I told myself it was part of being a mother and mother-in-law, a noble burden. Financially, I was a shadow of what I might have been. Without my own job for years, I depended on Daniel's generosity, which wasn't always steady. Especially with him and Lila juggling careers that sometimes sputtered and had their own troubles. I lived in a small, cluttered home filled with faded furniture that had known better days, and my savings were a distant memory. Bills sometimes got paid late. Luxuries were non-existent. Not that I couldn't have gotten by on my own. I could have, but I was entangled in the habit of giving and waiting for gratitude. What others saw was a cheerful, dedicated grandma and mother-in-law. Daniel's friends praised me for being warm and helpful. Lila's family complimented my cooking and patience. Neighbors saw me as the grandmotherly figure who was always ready to lend a hand. But how I saw myself was very different. Tired, overlooked, invisible outside of their needs. Some days I felt more like a fixture in their background than a person with hopes or dreams. I remember one afternoon when Daniel was little. He had scraped his knee badly at the park, and I'd rushed him to the emergency room. I stayed with him all night, holding his hand, whispering comfort while his fever broke. That night, after the nurses left, I looked down at his peaceful face and felt complete. But at the same time, I wondered what I'd missed in my own life while I was wrapped up in this role. That was decades ago, but the feeling of being tethered and invisible stayed with me. Another flashback hits me often. The day Lila first came into Daniel's life, I baked her a pie, tried to be welcoming. I shelved my own doubts and bruised pride when their marriage plans sped forward. Instead of expressing my feelings, I told myself it was because I loved them both. But, in truth, I was beginning to shrink away, giving more power to the family I was trying to support, losing sight of my own boundaries. My home is a reflection of my emotional state. Small and dim, in need of repair, with a faint musty scent that I try to cover with candles and air fresheners. The furniture is a patchwork of hand-me-downs, each piece holding a memory, some happier, some heavier. The walls often feel like they're closing in, like the weight of years of sacrifices pressed down on me. It's where I retreat at night, where I feel the quiet ache of loneliness I've normalized as the price of love. I talk to myself most nights now, wondering who I was before this endless cycle. I deprived myself of the basic emotional needs we all have: companionship, recognition for who I am beyond the roles I play, the freedom to dream beyond their expectations. The home where I live, the life I lead, is tangled in their daily lives, but often absent the warmth and respect I gave them. The truth is, I've seen myself through their eyes sometimes, as a burden, an afterthought, and in my own darkest moments, I started to believe it. I never said it aloud, but the shadow of being only useful when needed has shaped who I am. This quiet, invisible pain has been living inside me, growing alongside the roles I played. But this story, my story, is far from over. The pages ahead carry a weight of change that I can't ignore anymore. It's a slow, heavy process, but something inside me rustles awake, craving recognition, craving to be more than just a sacrifice. This is just the beginning of what I will show them. This is what a real burden looks like. The air was thick with laughter and chatter, a glossy veneer covering the sharp edges beneath. The room smelled faintly of perfume and expensive wine, but that sweetness was undercut by the sour tension pulsing just out of sight. Everyone was dressed to impress, their smiles bright and fleeting like lightning, behind a veil of social politeness. Crystal chandeliers scattered glittery patterns across the ceiling, and the clink of glasses punctuated the orchestra of soft jazz humming through the speakers. I stood near the corner, a silent figure watching, while the others swirled in their dances of gossip and shallow smiles. Every now and then someone caught my eye and nodded in a performative show of kindness, but I felt invisible, just part of the aftertaste no one wanted to linger with. Then it began. My son's wife, Olivia, approached with that rehearsed smile, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes, and whispered loudly enough for a few in our circle to hear. "Oh, that's Margaret, the unofficial maid who keeps the house running." Her voice dripped with condescension, sharp enough to cut through my carefully maintained calm. The room erupted in a chorus of chuckles, some masking their amusement, others openly relishing the moment. The sting was immediate and hot, like embers pressed against my skin. I felt the color drain from my face, my heart pounding against my ribs as if trying to claw its way out. My legs were stiff, but I managed to take several slow, measured breaths to stay upright. Each laugh felt like a nail being hammered into my dignity. My son, who I had sacrificed everything for, didn't say a word to defend me. He just stood there, shifting uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. That absence, his silence, hurt more than any sharp insult. The party continued, oblivious to my crumbling facade. I could hear muffled conversations and laughter, but none of it reached me. It was as if I were behind a thick pane of glass. The sparkling lights blurred and smeared, becoming nothing but streaks of shame. My hands trembled slightly, the room rocking with nausea, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from crying right there among them. This wasn't the first time I'd been invisible in a place that should have felt like home. My mind flickered back to moments from years ago, like when Ethan first came to me, sick and fragile, and I gave up so much to save him, or the night I turned my back on my marriage to give him a chance. Those memories, once warm and reassuring, now returned as bitter reminders of a debt unpaid. I felt exposed, a sacrifice discarded as if I were nothing more than a ghost in their lives. The house that was mine, the years of devotion, all dismissed with a cruel joke, yet no one stopped to comfort me. The laughter swelled, punctuated by sharp whispers. Someone asked, "Is she really still working for them?" Another snickered, "She looks like she works the kitchen, not the dining room." The weight of their eyes was suffocating. My body tightened, every muscle coiled and trembling. My breath came shallow and fast, the edges of panic brushing close. A cold sweat broke out along my spine, and my vision tunneled. I wanted to flee, to vanish, but I stayed rooted, forcing myself to endure what I had long normalized. Then Olivia's mother approached, her gaze cold and dismissive. "You don't belong here," she said so plainly it was like a verdict. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. A tremor ran through my hands as I clutched the purse strap tighter. I felt small, erased, as though I had become nothing more than a background prop in their faces of luxury. Among the crowd, one woman looked at me with something like pity. Her eyes met mine briefly, and I sensed a fleeting recognition of my pain. But no one said a word on my behalf. The party thrummed on, laughter louder, conversations continuing without pause. The final blow was subtle but sharp, a comment from one of my son's acquaintances. She should be grateful for what she had. Not everyone gets to be part of something so grand. Gratitude. That word tasted bitter on my tongue. I was supposed to be grateful for being invisible, for swallowed years of sacrifice, for being cast aside like an old coat. That night, the party was a cacophony of light, music, and scorn. The rich scent of wine mixed with the underlying odor of betrayal, and I stood alone among them, unseen and humiliated. As they toasted and danced, my heart constricted, cold and clenched like a fist. Holding steady, I reminded myself it was only one evening, one cruel act, but inside the fracture deepened. I could feel the whole world shrinking. The air was thick with judgment, pressing down on my shoulders like an unbearable weight. My mouth was dry, my skin prickling, heartbeat thumping erratically. I was the ghost no one wanted to acknowledge. That night, I finally understood how deep this invisibility ran, not just in their eyes, but in my own mind, where I had buried my worth beneath decades of martyrdom. And as the laughter echoed around me, a seed of something fierce took root in the darkness. This humiliation was not the end. It was the beginning. The evening light outside dimmed into an uneasy twilight as I made my way back home, the weight of everything that had happened pressing heavily on my chest. Each step echoed louder than usual on the cracked pavement, my breath shallow and uneven in the chilly air. The noise of the city, the distant honk of cars, the murmur of people chatting on sidewalks, reached me as if through a thick fog, muffled and distant. Inside, my mind raced through the swirling chaos of emotions that had settled uncomfortably into place after the humiliating event I had just endured. I was flooded with a clarity so sharp, it felt like a physical blow, sudden and overwhelming. Years spent bending myself, sacrificing my happiness to keep others comfortable, now revealed as a bitter pattern of exploitation I had been blind to for so long. I saw clearly for the first time in decades the depth of the emotional toll my sacrifices had exacted on me. 3 distinct memories rose up from the past, each one now tinged with painful new meaning. I recalled the night I gave up my college scholarship to stay home and care for my ailing mother. At the time, I told myself it was an act of love, selfless and unwavering. But now, I felt the sting of loss, a future surrendered, buried beneath obligation. Another memory came rushing in. The year I juggled 2 jobs, working long hours while my family demanded more and more of my time and energy. I smiled through exhaustion, swallowing my complaints and silencing my own needs. I had convinced myself this was simply what a devoted mother and wife did. Now, that story felt like a lie I had told myself to keep going. The final flashback was of the countless evenings spent alone. Once the house had gone quiet, the silence broken only by the muffled arguments I pretended not to hear. The sacrifices weren't just physical, they were emotional too. I had given up friendships, hobbies, and the very essence of myself to fit into a role that no longer suited me. I pressed my hand to my chest, trying to steady the sudden pounding of my heart. The pain wasn't just emotional, it felt embodied, solid and real. It was as though a veil had lifted, and the shadows of years of invisibility had been replaced by an intense, burning light. My thoughts tumbled in a raw, unfiltered tide. Was I really worth anything outside of these roles I'd played? Had I allowed myself to be an afterthought in my own life? The answers I wanted to avoid now demanded my full attention. As I navigated the familiar streets toward my apartment, I noticed how the world moved on without me. The faces that passed by were strangers, busy, detached, unconcerned. For so long I had defined myself through the needs of others. Now, I was forced to look inward for the first time in years. When I finally reached my door, the symbol of the life I'd lived, small, cluttered, and dimly lit, I hesitated. Changes were coming, but I wasn't sure I was ready yet. I unlocked the door slowly, stepping inside like wandering into a place half remembered, or perhaps a cell I had unwittingly locked myself into. The room was quiet, filled with the scent of old paper and faint traces of coffee. My gaze fell on the chair by the window where I often sat, exhausted after long days. I sank into it now, the fabric rough under my hands, its creak echoing my discomfort as I tried to process the flood of feelings. In this small space, I confronted the harsh truth. I had been invisible in my own story, a ghost haunting my family's lives, while my own faded into the background. But beneath the weight of this revelation, something shifted. A spark of defiance kindled in the depths of my being. I thought about the years I had endured, convincing myself that my pain was normal, even noble. I had neglected the most basic of my own needs: companionship, respect, and the simple joy of being seen and valued. These needs were not selfish. They were human. My mind reeled as the emotional whirlwind gave way to something steadier: determination. The old scripts would no longer dictate my actions. I acknowledged the ache in my shoulders and the tightness in my chest as the cost of awakening, but refused to let it define me. A small voice inside whispered insistently, "This is only the beginning. Tomorrow would not be like yesterday. Tomorrow, I would begin to write a new chapter, no longer a shadow cast by others' desires, but the author of my own story." I looked around the dim apartment, seeing the disorder differently. No longer a symbol of stagnation, but a canvas waiting for transformation. The dusty corners, the faded curtains, and the scattered belongings were reminders of a life I had outgrown. In the silence of the room, my breathing slowed and deepened, each inhalation a promise to myself. I would reclaim my voice, set boundaries, and nurture the parts of me long neglected. I would no longer sacrifice without reciprocity. The night deepened outside, wrapping the city in quiet darkness. Yet inside me burned a light, uncertain but growing stronger, illuminating a path away from pain and into possibility. I stood up from the chair and walked to the small window. Beyond the glass, faint stars flickered in the night sky, distant but present. I reached out, tracing a finger along the sill, and whispered into the silence, "I am here. I matter. I will be seen." In that moment, the first step had been taken. The road ahead was unknown and daunting, but I was no longer afraid to walk it. The old me, bound by invisible chains of sacrifice, had begun to break free, and while the journey would not be easy, the promise of freedom filled me with a quiet, fierce hope. I woke the next morning with a sense of calm determination settling over me, as if a heavy fog that had clouded my thoughts for years was finally beginning to lift. The air felt lighter, the light through the window less harsh and more welcoming. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel the possibility of change, not as a distant hope, but as something real, tangible, within reach. The pain and humiliation from the night before still stung, but beneath it all was a quiet fire, willing me to act. I started the day slowly, making a list. It was the first real plan I had made for myself in decades. I wrote down the things I needed to do, sorting financial documents I'd long neglected, calling a lawyer friend I barely knew but trusted, tidying the apartment to clear space in my mind, and most importantly, setting boundaries I had never dared to enforce. The list was simple, yet it embodied my first steps toward reclaiming my life. Gathering papers from the cluttered desk, I felt the weight of years of sacrifice materialize in receipts, unpaid bills, and letters I'd ignored. These documents were reminders not just of debt, but of the many concessions I had made. Career dreams laid aside, health ignored, friendships lost. I traced my fingers over the papers like a cartographer, mapping a landscape of endurance and loss. But today, these fragments were not chains. They were markers of a path I could now choose to redirect. When the phone rang later that day, my heart raced, but I answered without hesitation. It was the lawyer. Her voice was calm, steady, encouraging, exactly what I needed. I explained my situation simply, focusing on facts, omitting the pain I carried like a hidden ballast. We planned a meeting to discuss the legal steps I could take to protect myself, especially regarding finances I'd long felt powerless over. It was a small victory, taking up space, asking for help without shame. Returning to the apartment, I moved slowly but deliberately, tidying up the space. I cleared off the kitchen table, stacking papers into neat piles. The act of ordering my surroundings was a physical manifestation of the order I was demanding in my life. The once cluttered chaos now made way for openness and light. a symbolic breathing room where change could grow. Later, I sat by the window holding an old bracelet my mother had given me when I was a child. A simple silver piece, worn and dulled by time, yet still beautiful in its quiet strength. The bracelet represented more than sentimental value. It was a tangible link to a past before sacrifice, to my own worth beyond others' expectations. Sliding it onto my wrist, I felt a surge of resilience ripple through me, a reminder that despite all, I still existed and deserved to live fully. The afternoon sun warmed my face as I stepped outside, heading to a neighborhood cafe I used to love before life's demands swallowed time and space for myself. I ordered a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling my senses and grounding me. Around me, life moved in its usual hum, the chatter of strangers, the clink of cups on saucers, the steady rhythm of city footsteps. But instead of fading into the background as I once would have, I sat up straighter, accepting my presence as rightful and real. I made no dramatic announcements, no explosive confrontations. Instead, I resolved that every action, every call, every decision, every quiet moment of self-respect would accumulate into the change I yearned for. The silence of my rebellion was its strength. I could see the disbelief in the eyes of those around me when I began standing firm. My son's slight frown, my husband's terse questions, the friends who claimed concern but couldn't understand. Yet, I continued. The calm in my voice, the steadiness of my gaze, surprised even me. I was no longer shrinking, no longer invisible, and with each small boundary set, a refusal here, a demand for respect there, I built a fortress around my soul. One evening, after another tense conversation that ended without resolution, I took out my journal, open for too long, but filled now with fragments of a blossoming resolve. I wrote about fear, about hope, about everything I was losing and gaining. The words poured out as a release, each sentence stripping away old burdens. There was momentary doubt, shadows of old voices whispering that I was selfish, that I'd lose everything, that loneliness was my fate. But those were just echoes from the past struggling against the rising tide within me. Steeling myself, I breathed deeply, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest give way to something sturdier, strength birthed from vulnerability. Late that night, I stood before the mirror, shedding layers of years of neglect. My reflection was unfamiliar yet unmistakably mine. I touched the silver bracelet shining softly in the lamplight and whispered my promise to protect this newly found self from extinction. No loud declarations, no anger-fueled outburst, just quiet, potent transformation unfolding with deliberate care. Change born, not from rupture, but from reclamation of self. That week I met with a lawyer. Each question answered, each plan outlined, knotted the loose ends of my scattered life into something manageable and hopeful. I took back control, not through force, but through steady, persistent effort. As days passed, my small victories accumulated. Money handled with new attention, boundaries respected, if grudgingly. Moments of tenderness found unexpectedly with friends who now saw me differently. Each step, a layer peeled away from years of invisibility, careful and profound. This was not a story of sudden revolution, but a slow, steady dismantling of chains. Chains woven from years of self-sacrifice and invisibility. Now, each act of care for myself was a quiet defiance, a reclamation of dignity and light. I learned to hold space for my own needs, to hear the whisper of that inner voice I had stifled for so long. The room that once felt like a cage began transforming into a haven, walls steadier, air clearer, my silhouette growing bolder in the light. In these steps, small but unyielding, I found a seed of freedom, no longer a woman who merely survived, but one preparing to truly live, and the calm in my heart was the fiercest rebellion of all. The backlash was immediate, biting harder than I had anticipated. It came in waves, through cold stares from neighbors, whispered conversations where my name was tagged with disgust, and overt scorn from those closest to me. Amanda, my daughter, was the most vocal. Phone calls and texts flooded my small, quiet apartment. Each message carried a familiar weight of accusation, betrayal, and disbelief. The softness in her voice during our last call turned brittle and sharp as she said, Mom, you're tearing apart what little family we have left. I wanted to explain that my actions weren't about tearing down, but building me up. But the bridge between us was crumbling faster than I could span it. Chad, her father, and my ex-husband slipped into the chaos with a different strategy, intimidation threaded with blame. His words, always measured, now carried a venomous edge. How could you do this? After all the years you chose us over yourself, you throw it all away just like that? His disappointment was a weapon aimed to wound, and it struck deep. I acknowledged silently the truth in his words. I had chosen them, yes, but at the expense of losing who I was. It was a loss I could no longer bear. Their family joined in, reinforcing the chorus of reproach. Calls came from all directions. His mother, his brother, a cousin I dimly remembered. Their unified voice was a tide of judgment. You're selfish, ungrateful, crazy. The pain of their unanimous condemnation clawed at me, but somewhere beneath the hurt, a stubborn flame of resolve refused to be extinguished. The guilt was a persistent shadow, lurking in every message and call. Do you realize what you're putting Amanda through? She needs her mother. These weren't just words. They were chains trying to bind me back to a life of silent submission. At times, the familiar ache of duty and sacrifice threatened to pull me back into old patterns, but I fought it fiercely. Ignoring some messages, answering others with cold silence, I found strength in detachment. Each unanswered call was a tiny rebellion, each deleted message a small victory. They sought to manipulate me with emotion, to redraw the lines I had boldly erased. But their tactics only highlighted the toxicity of the environment I'd grown weary of enduring. Several attempts were made to breach my new walls. Amanda's voice, once warm and familiar, turned into an instrument of sorrow and frustration during a particularly raw phone call. "Why won't you just listen? We need you," she pleaded. Listening was no longer enough if it meant losing myself. Unexpectedly, a neighbor who had once admired my endless patience attempted to broker peace. In a dimly lit cafe, their gentle insistence that family always finds a way echoed hollowly against my hardened heart. I heard their words but could not embrace them. The old ways were dead, suffocated under years of neglect and one-sided sacrifice. Pressure mounted into persistent trespassing, late-night texts, unannounced visits, even confrontations in public spaces where I carefully avoided eye contact. One visit stood out vividly. Someone sat across from me in my own living room, their expression pleading, the unspoken request heavy in the charged silence. "Come back," the look said, but I remained unmoved, rooted in a newfound calm certainty. Isolation was my unwelcome companion during these weeks. Loneliness crept insidiously, whispering doubts that pried at my resolve. In the quiet, I questioned if the price of my freedom was too steep. Yet with each wave of doubt, I consciously reclaimed my boundaries, redrawing the map of my relationships with careful precision. This was a hard, necessary work, a shield protecting the fragile bloom of my self-respect, a confrontation with a former ally, someone I had trusted to stand by me, delivered a painful blow. Their words cut sharply. "You're throwing it all away. This isn't you. Don't let bitterness rewrite your story." Their faith in the person I was clashed with the woman I was becoming. I listened with heavy heart but spoke with unwavering clarity. My story was changing, and this new chapter required courage to write. The process was neither fast nor easy. Each rejection and accusation left a bruise, yet beneath the pain, I felt something grow, a slow, steady pulse of power and autonomy. I learned to say no, loudly and without apology. No longer would I be the silent supplier of others' comfort while my own needs lay barren. The retaliation revealed who they truly were: fearful, controlling, resistant to change. Despite their fierce pushback, I stood firm, unyielding. I was no longer the person who could be erased, dismissed, or overlooked. This was my life, and finally, I was living it on my own terms. With every attempt they made to pull me back into the shadows, I pushed forward. The sharp sting of loneliness was tempered by the warm glow of self-possession. I was reclaiming my voice, my space, my future. There was no turning back, only the steady step into the life I deserved. I found the letter on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that slipped by unnoticed, until a small envelope caught my eye hidden beneath years of forgotten papers in the back of a dusty drawer. Its edges were brittle, and the handwriting was familiar. My sister Margaret's, though I could have sworn we lost contact long ago. Curiosity wove through my fingers as I carefully opened it, revealing words that would shatter my world in ways I never imagined possible. Margaret wrote with urgency and sorrow, confessing secrets that had been kept from me all my life. As I read, the room around me seemed to close in. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of truth finally surfacing. She told me things I wasn't ready to hear, lies spun by the man I once loved, deceit that stretched back decades, hidden in the shadows of our shared past. She revealed that he had manipulated not just me, but the entire family. Financial betrayals that left me vulnerable, whispered promises broken without regret, and a trail of hidden accounts meant to control and trap me. I had lived so long in sacrifice, thinking it was my choice, when in fact, I was ensnared in a web carefully constructed to keep me powerless. The letter detailed how Margaret tried to expose these lies before her untimely death, but fear silenced her voice and protected the illusion I clung to. Suddenly, my life unfolded before me in a new light, each memory reinterpreted through the painful clarity the letter provided. I remembered the times I'd brushed off nagging doubts because I loved him and believed in us, the long nights spent working multiple jobs while he promised to make things better, only to disappear with money or lies. The moments my concerns were invalidated, dismissed as paranoia or ingratitude. All those sacrifices now felt like chains, locking me into a role I never actually chose. My hands trembled as a storm of emotions rushed through me. Fury, betrayal, grief. But amidst the chaos, a fragile sense of relief took root. Knowing the truth freed me in a way that years of suffering hadn't. It was as if I had been living under a heavy blanket of darkness, and suddenly the sun broke through, piercing every corner of my soul. I sank into a chair, clutching the letter like an anchor, and pictured the past in sharp detail. The Christmases spent alone because I was busy with his needs. The birthdays that passed quietly while I devoted myself to his chaotic world. The whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Those moments, once dismissed and forgotten, now screamed of a painful reality, one I had ignored to survive. In this altered light I saw myself, not as the selfless martyr I had believed, but as a woman trapped by deception, her compassion weaponized against her. The sacrifices weren't signs of love. They were scars left by manipulation. Slowly, a quiet fire kindled within me, a determination born of deep pain and newfound clarity. The letter was more than a confession. It was a key, unlocking the prison of my past and offering the chance to reclaim my life. The room seemed colder now, the shadows longer, but inside I felt a tremor of strength. The truth was raw and jagged, but it was real. It demanded I face what I had long avoided, accept that those I trusted had betrayed me, and that I deserved better. Hours passed as I reread Margaret's words, each line unraveling layers of denial built up over decades. The letter revealed betrayals I hadn't imagined, false financial ledgers, hidden bank accounts, secret debts in my name, and a coded correspondence between my husband and others plotting behind my back. Anger flared hot in my veins, but beneath it was an even deeper sadness for the years lost, for the trust shattered beyond repair. Yet with that sadness came a surprising sense of empowerment. Darkness at last was illuminated. I recalled the moments when I had felt unseen or unheard, times when I raised my voice only to be dismissed or shut down. Now those times weren't failures but warnings I had too long ignored. This realization was painful but necessary. It was the catalyst I needed. Sitting quietly, letter in hand, I began to envision a life beyond those chains. A world where I could choose my own path, where sacrifice would no longer define me. I realized that the truth I had uncovered was my strongest weapon. It stripped away illusions and gave me the courage to fight back, not with rage, but with clarity and purpose. The letter ended with a plea from Margaret, for me to protect myself, to seek freedom and happiness she had never been able to claim. Her words were a torch passed on, a lifeline to hold on to when despair threatened to swallow me whole. I folded the fragile paper carefully and placed it in my pocket. The noise of the outside world faded as a calm resolve took hold. This discovery had changed everything. I was not the broken woman I thought I was, but someone awakening to the possibility of real life, one that I would build on my own terms. As night settled, I reflected on the complexity of my emotions. The harsh sting of betrayal mingled with the lightness that comes with understanding. The scars left by years of deceit would not disappear, but they would no longer dictate my future. Alone in the quiet, I promised myself to carry this secret not as a burden, but as a source of strength. I would confront the lies, reclaim my power, and redefine my story. This was not just an ending. It was the beginning of my true self. The first step was taken quietly, but it was irrevocable. The chains were cracking, and freedom was finally within reach. Part 7. Final Confrontation and Liberation. The sun was setting behind the worn rooftops, casting long golden streaks across the cracked pavement as I approached the small familiar house. My hands trembled slightly, tightening into fists at my sides. Every step felt like walking through 1,000 memories, thick with pain and years of silent endurance. But this time wasn't about fear or submission. It was about finality, about saying what I'd long held inside, about reclaiming the parts of me that had been buried under decades of sacrifice. The front door was old and scratched, the paint peeling in spots where rain had seeped through the cracks. I could smell the faint scent of damp wood and mustiness, mixed with the lingering odor of burnt coffee and stale air, familiar and suffocating. A narrow walkway led up to that door, the stones worn uneven beneath my feet, like the path I'd walked in life, rough, uncertain, and full of hidden pains. When I knocked, the door swung open almost immediately, revealing him. His face was a mask of bravado, but I caught the flicker of surprise in his eyes, surprise that I had gathered enough strength to come here, to stand firm. "I didn't expect you," he said, voice low, as if testing the waters. "I'm here," I replied, steadying my breath. "We need to talk." The silence was thick as I stepped inside, my boots clicking on the wooden floorboards. The room was dim, shadows teasing every corner like ghosts from the past. The cracked wallpaper, the threadbare couch, the crooked picture frame, all spoke of a life long stuck in place. It was the physical embodiment of everything I was about to dismantle. We sat opposite each other, the space between us a chasm of all the things left unsaid. My heart hammered, but my voice was steady. "For years I lived only in the space you allowed me, the space you made for me," I began. "I sacrificed dreams, joy, even my own needs, all to keep the peace, to uphold your image, and to cover up the truth you refused to face." He looked away, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "You owe me. You don't get to just—" "No," I interrupted quietly but firmly. "I don't owe you anything anymore. Not my silence, my pain, or my life. I was invisible to you because I allowed it. I normalized my suffering because it kept the house standing. But this house is a prison, and I'm breaking free." His eyes narrowed. "You're being selfish, ingrate." I felt the old sting of those words, but this time I let them wash over me like cold water that wakes but doesn't wound. Selfish? Maybe, but I finally see myself. I see the years lost while I bent myself until I broke, and I refused to keep breaking for anyone else. He leaned forward, voice sharp and low. "You think you're better than me now? That you can just walk away after all I did?" "That's exactly what I think," I said, pulling myself up straight. "I'm done living in your shadow." The room seemed to hold its breath. I could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall, a slow, steady beat matching my rising pulse. We were at a crossroads where words would either shatter the past or chain me again. His anger flared, muscles tightening, but his control slipped. "You'll regret this. You'll come crawling back." I shook my head, feeling a surge of calm determination rise like a tide within me. "No, I won't, because this time I belong to myself, and that's the only place I'll live." With those words, I turned toward the door, feeling years of shame and doubt fall away behind me, like dead leaves in the wind. The faint creak of the door closing behind me echoed like a promise. Outside, the air was cool and fresh, a stark contrast to the stale, suffocating house. The street lamp flickered on, casting pools of light on the pavement. I inhaled deeply, savoring the clean night air mingled with the scent of wet earth and blooms from a nearby garden. The world felt different, open, vast, full of possibility. My legs no longer felt heavy. The weight on my shoulders had lifted. Every breath was lighter, freer. I didn't look back. I walked into the night, finally unbound. No longer someone's shadow, no longer silent, no longer lost. I was reborn in my own light. And nothing could take that away from me now. Tonight wasn't just an end. It was my beginning. And this time, I was walking forward alone. And that was exactly how I wanted it. The morning light filters gently through the curtains, painting soft patterns on the floor of my small sunlit room. It smells faintly of lavender, a scent I chose myself, a small victory in reclaiming my space. The walls, once dull and cold, now hold a quiet warmth, pale blues mingling with fresh white, colors that speak of calm and possibility. I sit by the window clutching a steaming cup of tea. The warmth seeps into my hands, grounding me in this moment, reminding me I am here, I am present, I am free. My new apartment is modest, but mine. It hums with the promise of a future not dictated by others. I've set up a little corner filled with books and the scattered sketches I've been hesitant to touch for years. This is where I will rebuild the parts of me I long ago buried. Hope, self-respect, a fierce and gentle love for myself that doesn't ask for permission. Today I perform a quiet ritual. I take a small candle from the shelf, unscented, simple. Lighting it, I watch the flame flicker, a symbol of resilience, a spark of life that refused to be extinguished despite everything. The flame dances, casting moving shadows that remind me of the long, dark nights I endured, and the dawns I dared to believe would come. As I breathe in, the sounds of the city float up to my ears. Distant laughter, the rustling of leaves stirred by a soft breeze, the faint melody of a street musician playing a hopeful tune nearby. It's all so different from the silence I lived in before, the silence of neglect and invisibility. Now, each sound feels like a thread, weaving me into the fabric of life again. I think of the people who once knew me but never truly saw me. There's a quiet sadness, yes, but no bitterness. I understand now that their blindness was never about me. It was about their own inability to connect honestly and deeply. My story no longer needs their validation. Instead, I've begun reaching out, slowly, carefully, to friends who value me, who listen and respond with kindness, who share their own struggles without erasing mine. Just yesterday, a neighbor stopped by with homemade bread, smiling warmly as she said, "You've been missed around here." That simple gesture felt like the sun breaking through the clouds, a quiet reassurance that I am not alone. My body feels lighter these days. The unseen weights of old fears and self-doubt, once chains wrapped tightly around my shoulders, now loosen with each conscious breath. There are scars, yes, reminders of battles fought, but they no longer define me. They are marks of survival, proof of endurance. In this new chapter, I am learning to say no without apology, to protect my time and energy fiercely, to honor my needs as sacred, not selfish. This is a language I am still learning, words unfolding gently from my lips, in moments both raw and proud. Sometimes, when the quiet of night descends and old memories creep in like shadows, I remind myself I am more than my past sacrifices. I am more than the roles I was forced to play. I am a woman reclaiming her story, one breath, one step, one moment at a time. Looking forward, I see a horizon unmarked by chains. Possibilities stretch wide and open, the future a canvas awaiting my hand. There is still uncertainty, of course, but it no longer frightens me. It challenges me. I rise from the chair, feeling the smooth floor beneath my feet, solid and real. The candle flickers once more, then steadies, its flame a quiet but powerful symbol of hope, of strength, of a life finally lived for myself. I am here, I whisper to the morning, and this is only the beginning.